Welcome, everybody. On behalf of the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, I'd like to thank you for joining us for today's webinar titled Bringing Low-Cost Wind Power to the Southeast. My name is Erin Cameron, and I'm the Development and Outreach Coordinator for Southern Alliance for Clean Energy. Before we get started today, I'd like to just take a moment to review the basic functions of your control panel. If you'd like to minimize your control panel, just select the orange arrow here to the left-hand corner, and then just select it again to display the panel. To ensure sound quality, all attendee lines will be muted throughout this presentation, but we encourage you to please type in any questions you may have using the questions box on your control panel, and we'll answer these questions at the very end of the presentation. For those of you not familiar with Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, we are a regional organization focused on promoting responsible energy choices that create global warming solutions and ensure clean, safe, and healthy communities throughout the Southeast. We are a membership organization, and I'd like to acknowledge any of our members on this call and encourage those of you who are not members to please join us today. For ways in which you can become a member and get involved, please visit our website, cleanenergy.org. And now to get us started, I'd like to introduce Simon Mahan, SACE Renewable Energy Manager. Simon?
Thanks, Erin. So good morning, everyone. My name is Simon Mahan. I'm the Renewable Energy Manager for the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy. I focus most of my work specifically on advocacy and policy work regarding wind energy, from basically Louisiana, where I'm based, all the way up to Virginia and all the states in between. The Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, we work on wind energy that's not only land-based within our states, but also wind energy that can be imported from other regions, and then also offshore wind energy as those opportunities arise. So today, we have a couple of speakers from Cleanline Energy Partners. As some of you may be aware, Cleanline is a proposed high voltage direct current transmission project that could import up to approximately 3,500 megawatts of high quality, low cost wind power from the Oklahoma Panhandle directly into Memphis with an additional 500 megawatt converter station in Arkansas. So our two speakers today, let me go ahead and introduce them. Our first speaker is going to be Chris Hardy. Chris serves as an associate on the Plains and Eastern Cleanline project. In his role, Chris supports efforts across all aspects of project development, including community outreach, public relations, routing, and permitting. Prior to joining Cleanline, Chris worked at the U.S. Offshore Wind Collaborative, where he helped promote offshore wind energy development along the Atlantic coast. He previously served as Director of Legislative Affairs at the Massachusetts Audubon Society, where he developed relationships with legislators and other policymakers to protect critical wildlife habitat. Our second speaker today is going to be Hank Seltzer, an environmental associate with Cleanline, and he supports environmental siting, permitting, and natural resource regulatory affairs for all of Cleanline's projects. Prior to joining Cleanline, Hank was an environmental advisor for BP Wind Energy, where he managed environmental affairs for more than 2,000 megawatts of wind energy in various stages of development, primarily in the eastern United States. So with that, Chris and Hank, if you'd like to go ahead and get started, please do.
Thanks, Simon. Appreciate that. Good morning, everyone. On behalf of my colleague, Hank Seltzer, I am excited to be here this morning to speak with you about the Plains and Eastern Cleanline project and about Cleanline's approach to developing long-haul transmission projects. We're grateful for this opportunity and thank SACE and Simon for setting this time up. Cleanline Energy was founded in 2009. Our president and CEO, Michael Skelly, was the former head of development at Horizon Wind Energy. And throughout his leadership, the company grew from a two-man company into one of the largest wind energy developers in the United States. It was throughout his wind development experience that Skelly really saw the need for long-haul transmission lines to really move America's vast renewable energy resources, which you can see highlighted in the purple shaded area, often known as the wind belt, move those resources to market areas to the east and to the west that have a high demand but lack access to the same quality and strength of resources. The existing transmission system, which you can see marked here by the green lines, was really created as a result of local utility planning to connect population centers with primarily fossil fuel plants that were nearby. the greatest wind resources in that purple shaded area, you can see there's a real lack of existing transmission lines. And so all 5 of our transmission line projects are oriented around that same philosophy to connect those resources where they are plentiful but lack the meaningful connections to market. All of our projects, with the exception of the Western Spirit, utilize high voltage direct current, and that's really the preferred technology for moving large amounts of power across long distances. Direct current technology has as many benefits over comparable alternating currents or AC systems for moving this level of power. Overall, DC lines result in higher efficiency, reliability, and controllability. Those are all key advantages for the integration of variable power like wind. Unlike AC lines where electricity can flow in the path of least resistance, HVDC technology allows the grid operator to directly control the withdrawal and injection of electricity on the line. Over long distances, DC transmission lines move power with less electric loss than comparable AC systems. And also, very importantly, in the area that we're working in, as you can see by the 2 graphics below, DC systems utilize a narrower right-of-way system and fewer transmission structures, thereby making more efficient use of existing lands and minimizing the visual and overall impact. So the combination of utilizing narrower rights-of-way, fewer structures with decreased electric losses translates into a lower transmission cost, which helps enable renewable energy to compete against other power sources. Clean Line's portfolio of projects would facilitate the development of over 17.5 gigawatts of wind power, which is roughly equal to about 1/4 of the country's current installed wind capacity. All told, our projects would power more than 6.5 million homes throughout the country with low-cost clean energy. Our project's delivery of wind energy into the MISO, PJM, and Southeast regional systems would reduce carbon emissions by almost 40 million tons. The Plains and Eastern Clean Line project alone would reduce carbon emissions by 12 million tons. And as a percentage of carbon emissions from coal, these reductions are appreciable. If you look at the Plains and Eastern Clean Line, you can see potential emissions reductions from coal of over nearly 1.5% in Arkansas, over 10% in Tennessee, 4% in Mississippi, nearly 4% in Alabama. The Plains and Eastern Clean Line, going a little bit step further, is a 720-mile overhead transmission line that will connect about 4,000 megawatts of new wind power from the Oklahoma Panhandle region to Arkansas, Tennessee, in other states in the Mid-South and Southeast, through an intermediate converter station in Pope or Conway County, Arkansas. We deliver up to 500 megawatts of wind energy to the grid that's operated by the MISO system. It will also deliver up to 3,500 megawatts to the TVA system through an interconnection with a Shelby substation in western Tennessee. And at that delivery point in Tennessee, any utility with a connection to TVA's transmission system is a potential customer. What value does Plains and Eastern bring to utilities that are connected to these regional grids? Well, on a levelized cost basis, you can see that wind energy is competitive with other sources of new generation, with or without the production tax credit, and high capacity wind, such as that's found in the Oklahoma Panhandle region, can see costs under 4 cents a kilowatt hour on a levelized cost basis. Wind also, of course, provides a host of non-market benefits in terms of a reduction of negative externalities. Apart from the substantial carbon dioxide emission reductions, I would also point out the huge water savings, almost 4.5 billion gallons saved. Of course, wind does not need water in the volumes that traditional fossil plants need for cooling. In an area like Arkansas and Oklahoma, where water is scarce and a precious resource, those savings have huge value. And so where are we in terms of potential customers? Well, in May of 2014, Cleanline received a negotiated rate authority from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to conduct an open solicitation process. And through this open solicitation process, we received transmission requests that amount to over 4 times the project's total capacity. The results of this process demonstrate to us that there is a significant demand in the marketplace for the wind energy that we can deliver on our line. Cleanline continues to advance through the various interconnection processes with the various regional transmission organizations and utilities that are impacted. On the western end, a facility study has been completed, and we are now finalizing our interconnection agreement. We've entered the MISO definitive planning phase this quarter and have completed a feasibility study that showed no improvements to the system were needed. And then out on the eastern end, we've completed our system impact study with TVA. We began the facility study last July and are beginning interconnection service agreement negotiations. Through the facility study, TVA identified any required upgrades to the network that are needed in order to accommodate the interconnection of our project to their substation. And we're coordinating the design of our system with TVA's engineers. Ultimately, the approval of the project and interconnection with TVA will be memorialized in that interconnection service agreement. We will only interconnect to the transmission grid once we've completed all of these necessary and required interconnection studies. At the same time, we continue to have very productive discussions with a number of potential customers throughout the region regarding the purchase of low-cost wind energy delivered through our project and the ways that we can help meet their reliability and energy needs. Many of these customers have expressed a strong interest in using the project to deliver low-cost wind energy to their customers. At this time, we do not have any signed contracts, but we wouldn't expect to, given the stage of development that we're in. But we know, for example, with our transmission service requests through our open solicitation process, that a number of those requests were provided as a result of, for example, Entergy's recent RFP system, RFP process rather, and that there are a number of other planning processes underway that would facilitate the development of those projects using our transmission line. We, in January of 2015, received our Certificate of Convenience and Necessity from the Tennessee Regulatory Authority, which provides us with both the siting approval and the ability to operate as a transmission-only public utility in Tennessee. This is a critical part to our operations in the state of Tennessee. You'll hear a little bit more about from my colleague Hank regarding our Section 1222 partnership and the environmental impact review that's ongoing there. But obtaining the CCN from the TRA was a critical step towards the development of this project in the state of Tennessee.
Very good. Okay, this is Hank. Thanks, Chris, for the overview of Cleanline and the Plains and Eastern project. You know, those are some important things to keep in mind here. High-level overview, that is, of the Plains and Eastern project and the environmental benefits that it provides, and certainly the scale of renewable energy that we're talking about, potentially bringing to the Mid-South and Southeast. So I'd like to get a little bit more into the weeds of process right now and talk about how we how we developed really a route and a path forward with the project along 720 miles from the Oklahoma Panhandle to the Memphis area onto TVA system. This all stems really from a provision in the 2005 Energy Policy Act. In particular, Section 1222 of the Energy Policy Act of 2005, in essence, provides the framework for the Department of Energy to form public-private partnerships with the private sector to expand critical transmission infrastructure in strategically identified areas. So we're talking about an HVDC, a high voltage direct current transmission line here. And if you think back to one of the first maps that we showed, the NREL wind map and the existing transmission infrastructure overlaying with that map, there were one or two lines in the continental U.S. That are existing HVDC lines. So while the technology is existing in the United States and it's certainly proven here, we as a country haven't installed a new HVDC line in a couple of decades. The technology does exist elsewhere in the world and is being built currently elsewhere in the world. In fact, China has been pretty aggressive with planning and building out HVDC technology of its own to facilitate all kinds of power generation and load needs that they've identified due to a growing population. So 1222, in our case, in our specific instance here, would enable the Southwestern Power Administration, which is a federal power marketing authority, to use their existing siting authority on our behalf. We are developing the project, and ultimately 1222 would allow us to partner with DOE in some to-be-determined manner to basically operate the project once it's built. It's worth noting, though, that as I mentioned, Cleanline is responsible for developing the project, which we've been working on for the past several years. It's also our responsibility to secure financing and the private capital that would be at risk here to finance and build the project. And that's a fundamental difference between the typical model that folks in the Southeast and Mid-South see, that their investor-owned utilities use by rate basing their new infrastructure requirements. So we are a merchant model, which is distinctly different from the sort of typical rate-based infrastructure model. Okay, so again, back to 1222. In July of 2010, Cleanline responded to an original proposal that DOE had, a request for proposals under Section 1222 to evaluate potential projects. We responded and were selected from that applicant pool, and have since, as recently as last month and this month, sent revised 1222 applications to the Department of Energy. And so these revised applications more or less detail the progress that we've made since July of 2010. We demonstrate how the project meets the criteria under Section 1222 so that it's eligible for this public-private partnership. We included a draft participation agreement with SWPA, the Southwestern Power Administration. And here in, I'm not quite sure the time scale, but the next couple weeks or so to a month, DOE will notice the application in the Federal Register, will make copies of the application available on its website, and that will initiate a formal 45-day public comment period. And ultimately, the DOE will indicate its method of participation in the record of decision, which we anticipate ideally by the fourth quarter of this year. So back to routing for a little bit. In 2009 or so, perhaps a little bit later, we started looking at study areas, which were just to identify the endpoints of the conception of the project. Where did we want to start? What were the high quality wind areas we wanted to try and take advantage of, and where might we deliver this energy. Over the next 5 years, we really, with critical help from the public and from state and federal agencies, developed an iterative process where we first identified corridors of potential routes that were 5 miles wide, and within those corridors looked for siting opportunities and constraints. Opportunities being things like existing linear infrastructure that we could parallel, like rail lines, certainly existing transmission lines, gas pipelines, things like that. Divisions of property or sort of natural linear features might also be considered opportunities, whereas constraints would be things that you might want to avoid when siting a transmission line, like schools, homes, churches, cemeteries, national wildlife refuges, endangered species, critical habitat, things like that. So you're trying to strike the optimal balance between opportunities and constraints as you further refine your route during this iterative process, all while obtaining input from the public, which we did in 2012 once we developed the network of potential routes, which you see towards the bottom of the screen here. And that's when we asked the public for their feedback and tried to identify maybe things that we had missed during our desktop analysis in the years prior as we were working on our corridors, our corridor network, and our study corridors. The network of potential routes were ultimately captured in the draft environmental impact statement, which I will talk about here in a few minutes. It's probably a good point to move to the next slide. And so during this iterative route development process, I mentioned the importance of stakeholder feedback. And it's something we really pride ourselves on, and this really just is a snapshot of more than 5 years of working with the public on this process. We had meetings in 2012, as I mentioned, when we presented the network of potential routes to the public and solicited feedback from landowners, from community leaders, business members, you name it. It was anybody that wanted to give us information, we welcomed it, along with state and federal agencies. We had business opportunity meetings in 2012 as well, open houses in the years leading up to the draft environmental impact statement. And then last year, just prior to the draft EIS, we held office hours in many of our communities along the network of potential routes, and had pretty good turnout for those too. So this was all sort of leading up to the draft environmental impact statement. I'll take a step back actually and mention the reason that we're going through NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. This isn't something that's necessarily customary for other types of linear infrastructure, but because of the decision that's inherent in Section 1222, that is, whether or not the Department of Energy chooses to participate through SWPA in this project, that's considered a major federal action. And major federal actions, of course, trigger NEPA. So this project is being reviewed, or the impacts from this project are being reviewed in a draft environmental impact statement that's all of about 4 months old right now and several thousand pages long. And we certainly encourage anybody to take a spin through it if you haven't had a chance yet. It's a really good document. The draft EIS analyzes the impacts through all stages of the project. So that's construction, operations, and maintenance, and decommissioning for the life of the project across the route for 19 different natural or socioeconomic resource categories. So it runs the gamut from things like wetlands, floodplains, surface waters, to protected species, both plant and animal, to things like noise and environmental justice. So it considers the human and natural environment in its analyses. The public comment period has recently been extended to April 20th, so you have a little bit more time if you would like to delve into the document and provide the DOE some comments on the analysis. We're sort of all appreciative of any feedback we can get. It will only help to better crystallize sort of the way the impacts are characterized and analyzed in the final environmental impact statement, as well as leading to a better route ultimately. The final EIS is something that after the DOE compiles all the public comments, reads them, responds to them, and then takes into account what modifications might need to be made from the draft to the final, will then publish the final EIS later this year, probably in the fourth quarter. So there was a public comment period, in addition to the larger public comment period on the draft EIS, DOE also held public meetings in February, so just last month, across communities along the 720-mile route, starting in Guymon, Oklahoma in late January, and really culminating with meetings along the eastern end in Millington, Tennessee, and then doubling back and revisiting some communities in Arkansas towards the end of the public comment period there, the public hearing period, I should say. We had good turnout. Over 1,500 people attended these DOE public hearings. Roughly a third of the oral comments made during the comment portion of the meetings were favorable towards the Plains and Eastern project. And all in all, it was a good process, and we think DOE got a lot of good feedback from landowners, from community members, from business leaders, and really just those folks that were interested in the project and making their voices heard. That process continues, and you know, one large component of public feedback is, of course, comments on where the routes are and why or why not a specific segment of a route is a good idea or not. And so landowners have been voicing those concerns, and the DOE is taking them into consideration, making them part of the administrative record, and will adjust you know, the final EIS as needed. So we are internally working to analyze these changes or suggested changes to the route as they come in, and we're doing this with all kinds of considerations in mind. Landowners are certainly making suggested changes during the DIS public comment period and to us directly through some of our land agents that are out in the field. We're learning about areas where the route may need to change based on additional information that we're obtaining due to environmental surveys or engineering surveys like geotechnical work. And of course, the public comment period is going to remain a stream of information for another 5 weeks or so. And I'll let Chris speak briefly here about our work with landowners, specifically the unique approach we've taken to a compensation package and easement acquisition.
Yes, that's right. Thanks, Hank. Our compensation package is considered fairly unique in the linear infrastructure world for a variety of components. The first is that we will pay for 100% of the fee value for the fair market value of the land through which we're needed for our 200-foot wide easement. The landowner retains, of course, ownership and use of the land, but we'll go about determining that fee value both through a county-wide market study as well as independent individual appraisals of property as needed. And in addition, Clean Line will provide a payment for every structure that may be located on their property. And at the landowner's option, that can be a one-time upfront payment per structure or an annual payment per structure. The annual payment increases 2% every year. So that means that a landowner who has a structure on their property will receive more than 100% of the fee value. And finally, the third component, if there are any impacts to things like crop yields, marketable timber, irrigation systems, other important assets, then we will also provide compensation. So we're hopeful that the combined use of HVDC technology, which allows for more efficient, more narrow right-of-way, and the combination of our compensation package will help, in conjunction with the siting as well, limit the overall impact to individual properties and respect individual landowners' property rights.
Thanks, Chris. Let's dive back into the NEPA world just for another moment here. And there are two sort of concurrent processes worth mentioning, concurrent with the EIS drafting, both, well, EIS draft and final, I should say. One is the Section 7 consultation, and that refers to the Endangered Species Act, Section 7, which is triggered when when a federal agency undertakes a major decision or a major action. So in this case, the Department of Energy will be consulting with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and that's the agency-to-agency consultation that's prescribed under Section 7. Cleanline is the designated non-federal representative, so we've had some responsibility in the early stages of the non-formal consultation period under Section 7 to draft a biological assessment which characterizes the potential impacts to federally threatened and endangered species, both plants and animals, aquatic and terrestrial, for all stages of the project: construction, operations and maintenance, and decommissioning. We've prepared that draft BA, or biological assessment, and sent it to the Department of Energy, Tennessee Valley Authority, SWAPA, SWPA, and the U.S. Army Corps for their review. That review is nearly complete, and in fact, we should be sending the final biological assessment over to the Department of Energy here in the next couple of days, probably by next Monday, the 16th, at which point the Department of Energy would initiate formal consultation with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and that would then kick off a period of review for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, where they determine more or less the accuracy of the biological assessment, and then we'll turn around a biological opinion, or a BO, probably sometime later this year. I imagine that will be concurrent or loosely concurrent with the issuance of the final EIS, so sometime in fourth quarter of this year. On the cultural and historic side, Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act requires federal agencies to take into account the impacts of their decisions on cultural and historic properties and resources. And it also gives the American Council of Historic Properties and the State Historic Preservation Officers, or SHPOs, an opportunity to comment on these potential impacts to cultural or historic properties as well. So we have a more recent history of consultation with the SHPOs, the TIPOs, which are the Tribal Historic Preservation Offices, and tribes that might be affected along the way as well. So we most recently have developed a draft identification plan that would basically spell out the process for the discovery and treatment of any unanticipated cultural or historic artifacts that might be uncovered during construction, and then also are in the drafting process of a programmatic agreement, which is being reviewed by all the consulting tribes and TIPOs and SHPOs along the way. So sorry for all the acronyms here. If any of this is confusing or not making sense, feel free to ask questions when we get to the Q&A period. So that brings us really to conclusion of the details, but this will give you a sense of the overall timeline for the project, and maybe a sense of recent history here as we kicked off the project in May of 2009. Spent several years doing outreach, obtaining feedback on the iterations of route networks and study corridors, and ultimately proposed routes that we developed. We were beginning some right-of-way acquisition at the time at our risk, and also having some pre-permitting discussions with state and federal agencies. 2014 and 15 have really been geared around the NEPA process and preparing for the draft EIS and now the final EIS, and also remaining engaged in the communities along the way and building relationships with landowners. All of this anticipating a potential construction start date next year in 2016, possibly in the second quarter of next year. We think the construction will take about 2 years or so, at which point we could potentially be energized and commercially operating in 2018, and that would mean power on the lines, generated by the wind turbines, and delivered into TVA system in Shelby County, Tennessee.
And to make all this happen, we need your support. The development of major public infrastructure projects takes a long time, and it raises a number of concerns. But through this project, the Southeast region, the U.S. as a whole, has an unprecedented opportunity to develop the full potential of our country's renewable energy resources and help lead to a healthier, cleaner economy. We hope that you'll consider signing a support letter at the website address that you can see on the screen. The public comment period concludes on April 20th, and we encourage you to also submit comments on the specifics of the draft environmental impact statement. We really are grateful to SACE for this opportunity and look forward to responding to any questions you might have.
Great. Thanks, guys. If you want, you can go ahead, Chris and Hank, just leave that slide up there so folks can have the opportunity to either write down the URL or otherwise. I do want to make sure that everybody knows this, as Aaron mentioned before, this webinar will be recorded, and so you should be able to have access to these things. And we'll also shoot over some URLs of web addresses so you can comment on the environmental impact statement. So let's go ahead and jump into questions. Just a reminder to folks that if you do have a question, you can ask your question in the control panel, and we'll get to it as time allows. Our first question here is a bit outside of the scope, but I'm going to throw it to you guys to see if y'all can answer it. But is it financially feasible to generate wind power in the mountains of northeastern Georgia through the Blue Ridge Mountain EMC?
This is Hank, and I think I will take a stab at that. So the question is it financially feasible to generate power on some of the ridgetop sites in the southern Appalachians? I'm going to base this answer on previous experience working in Virginia and West Virginia and eastern Kentucky on some wind projects in my former life, but I will caveat that with the fact that my experience with that ended in late 2011, so I might be a little bit dated here, and Simon, actually, you might be able to help me out. But
sure.
I would say that it is probably financially feasible. In my experience, scale was always one of the biggest constraints to developing some of these ridgetop Appalachian wind sites. The wind, in my experience, was quite good at some sites, but they were rather small in their potential to hold a lot of megawatts, really. You could only find so many sites that were privately owned and potentially suitable for wind generation that could also accommodate the number of turbines that it would take to really make a project financially attractive. So I think it would be financially feasible. You'd have to find the right site with terrific wind, and it would have to be in proximity to existing transmission infrastructure so that you could get the power somewhere. And constructability was also a major cost constraint for some of these ridgetop development sites. They are expensive to build because they are major civil engineering projects.
That's a great answer, Hank. One other thing to kind of provide additional clarity on this, if you could you give kind of a project size estimate for a mountaintop wind project versus what CleanLine might be able to provide?
Yeah, that's a good point. In my experience, the tipping point for ridgetop wind being economically feasible was roughly about 80 megawatts. 80 to 100 megawatts, and if you assume a certain number of sort of megawatts per linear mile of ridgetop, that adds up to several dozens of turbines required at a minimum to make a ridgetop project viable. So 80 to 100 megawatts for a ridgetop site, whereas for the CleanLine Plains of the Eastern project, we're talking about a build out that we could accommodate on our line of more than 4,000 megawatts in the Oklahoma Panhandle. And I would say that there is a difference in the resource too. I mean, by and large, the wind in the Oklahoma Panhandle is just stronger and more consistent, and probably has a different sort of generation profile than ridgetop wind in the Southern Appalachians does as well. So it's advantageous for a number of reasons, first and foremost being scale.
Great. Thanks, Hank. We'll go ahead and move on to the next question. What is the percentage of power loss for the transmission project?
Sorry, we were kind of putting our heads together on this one. Yeah, neither
sure.
of us are engineers. We believe it's somewhere around 4 or 5%. So from generation point to delivery point in TVA system would be about roughly around a 5% power loss. And that's one of the advantages of DC is the ability to keep those line losses at a minimum over such a long distance, which is something that AC at that distance can't accomplish.
Yes, our sense is that with a comparable AC system, the losses would be somewhere in the range of 12 to 15%. So there's an order of magnitude difference, and why DC is a more efficient method for transporting large amounts of power over long distances.
That's great. Next here, question is, since the line will be built in Tornado Alley, do you have a plan to staff crews to restore power when this happens?
We don't have any concrete plans right now. I'd say that's something we're certainly aware of. The safety of workers is actually analyzed, and safety of workers and of the overall reliability of the line itself is something that's analyzed in the draft EIS. So I might point the questionnaire to the draft EIS if they were looking for a more specific answer, but we don't have any concrete plans right now. Certainly, it's something that we hear all the time.
Yes, we hear this a lot, and that's also another advantage of HVDC in that it gives the grid operators complete controllability. So we can in the advent of a major storm, we can shut the line down in a nanosecond.
Great. Next question. Does your levelized cost of power include additional cost of generation to make wind as reliable as?
We missed that last part there, Simon. Reliable as?
As a gas plant or a nuclear plant.
Okay. Additional cost of generation. No, that's not something I think it accounts for.
And if you could kind of explain why that doesn't account for that, that would be great.
Well, because we're a merchant model, we're really only responsible for in our sort of proposed delivered cost, accounting for the cost that we think is necessary to recoup the investment that investors have made in the project. So, I think maybe what the question is getting at is where else in the grid system might there be reliability issues as a result of bringing on a large volume of intermittent resources like wind power. And those types of questions are answered in the engineering studies that the 3 engineering studies that Chris mentioned in our slides that we are in various processes of going through with the independent system operators in the 3 geographies that matter. So on the western end, SPP, MISO in Arkansas, and then TVA on the delivery end in the east. So between those 3 final studies, we will know where upgrades to the system or each system are required in order to maintain reliability.
That's right. And the MISO studies to date have not shown that any improvements are needed, whereas the TVA latest studies did provide a scope for some potential network upgrades that would be required in order for the interconnection of our project into the TVA system. And all the final decisions will be negotiated through the interconnection service agreement.
Great. Okay, let's move on to our next question. Is it considered safer to live in proximity to a high voltage direct current conveying line as alternating current lines?
Good question. By safety, I'll take it the question's referring to potential health impacts. That's a question that we receive quite frequently in reference to electrical and magnetic fields that are created by transmission lines. And this is studied extensively in the draft environmental impact statement. There's a number of pages in the chapter on electrical environment that I'd encourage people to read. It gives a far more detailed analysis than I can provide, in a short answer. But existing studies conducted by scientific and governmental agencies on the potential health effects of direct current lines have found that there are no adverse health impacts to humans, to domestic animals, to wild animals, to crops. And that the electric and magnetic fields that may exist underneath the transmission line are comparable to those that are found, naturally occurring. Each of us, for example, sitting in front of our computer screens right now, is being exposed to EMF at some level, and so the question becomes about, at what point do you meet the safe thresholds that have been determined by scientific bodies, and the draft environmental impact statement found that our high voltage direct current line operated well within reasonable guidelines that have been established for monitoring health effects, and so we're confident that our project is safe for people, though of course no definitive conclusions could be made, but the most relevant scientific evidence has shown that there are no adverse health impacts.
And I would add really quickly that Chris mentioned this is covered in the electrical environment section of the draft EIS. And if you recall the multiple years of iterative routing work that we did, maintaining a safe distance from homes was critical during that process. I mean, arguably the most important, routing constraint that we had. So it's something that we took very seriously for a long time and continue to do so.
Great. And if I could actually have you guys run back to slide 8 really quick. Can you go back? It's regarding the levelized cost of energy. Yeah, that might be it. So here's the question. Do the levelized cost of energy numbers you show on slide 8 include the wheeling charges to bring the wind power from Oklahoma to Tennessee? And if not, what do you expect the range of wheeling charges to be?
I don't think that it does. I think these are as delivered, assuming no wheeling. Because we're directly injecting into TVA and also potentially into Arkansas, I'm not a systems engineer here, so I'm not certain that wheeling charges would be required, but I could be mistaken.
Yeah, there would be. We're providing a direct, dedicated service to the MISO system and the TVA system. Now, for the electricity to be delivered to an adjacent system, Southern Company, Duke, et cetera, all the other load-serving entities that I showed you on the one of the slides, with whom we've had productive discussions. There could be wheeling charges to those systems, but to TVA there's no wheeling charge. That's one of the rationales behind our project. All told, we figure roughly that the project can deliver a price to TVA that's between 4 to 5 cents per kilowatt hour. So the wind is somewhere between 2.5 cents a kilowatt hour, and the transmission service is roughly another 2 cents on top of that. And it's at a slightly lower level to reach the MISO system, given the slightly shorter distance.
And just to be exceptionally clear here, the prices you're showing here, the 4.1 cents per kilowatt hour and the 5.9 cents per kilowatt hour, that includes not only the cost of building the Clean Line project, but also the cost of the wind projects themselves. Is that correct?
It's just the delivered cost for the Plains and Eastern Clean Line. That would not include. I guess there's not a direct link there to the capital costs of the wind farms, but I suppose there is an indirect link in that a wind farm developer in their proposed price to us would include they would have to recoup their capital investment for building the wind farm. So there's an indirect link there, but it doesn't include the direct cost of the wind farm. No.
Well, and just to go back on what Chris was saying, the transmission cost was going to be about 2 cents per kilowatt hour, and the power purchase agreement prices were going to be about 2.5 cents per kilowatt hour. Is that right? That's where you ended up getting these numbers.
Rough estimate, yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, what happens when the wind doesn't blow?
Then there's no power on the line, or there's minimal power on the line depending on where the wind is blowing. I mean, I think we have we don't anticipate very many instances where zero of the several thousands of turbines in the Oklahoma Panhandle that are connected to the Plains Eastern Clean Line would not be blowing. I suppose those opportunities will happen at some point, but I think we expect them to be few and far between. But sure, if that's the worst case scenario, then there wouldn't be power on the Plains and Eastern Line.
Yeah, I mean, that's just to reiterate the scale benefits that we talked about. The wind farms that could connect to our project extend throughout a 40-mile square radius of Guymon, Oklahoma, which has some of the strongest, most dependable winds in the U.S. So, we are quite spread out over the surface area, and so it's highly unlikely that the wind will stop blowing across this wide area. It may stop in certain locations, but the profile shows pretty consistent winds if you look at it across the geographic area through which these projects could interconnect.
Great. Well, that's all the questions that we have here, and we're running up on top of the hour. So with that, I think we'll go ahead and close up, and I'll send it back over to Erin for her to wrap this up.
Thanks, Simon. Thanks, everybody, for joining us today and for your thoughtful questions. As Simon mentioned, today's presentation has been recorded and will be available on the webinar archive page of our website, cleanenergy.org. We will also be sending a link to that recording once it has been processed in the follow-up for this webinar. And Simon, you had mentioned we would include some URLs for your reference as well. So we appreciate your support and interest and hope that you'll join us again. Thanks, guys.